the great talks. We've had talks with Disney, we've had Tech Week this year. If you can't find an Amplify, just reach out to me. There's some links as well. We've got a few people from outside the museum today, so welcome. Thank you for coming up to the top of the hill. Cheers for being here. A few housekeeping things for you. We've got some toilets just out through here. If you turn right out through the auditorium, just walk 10 metres, there's some toilets there. Also, the museum's a bit of a labyrinth at the moment because of all the building work, so if you get lost, don't walk. Walk out, and we'll see some security staff out there, they can help you guide out. But try to just come in the way that you can back in after those classes. Appreciate it. Our speaker for this month's Futureslam is Chris McDowall. He's a geographer and expert data visualisation designer, and he does a lot of work with the spin-off. If you haven't seen any of his work, I highly recommend you jump on there. Some great insights about politics, wage gaps, salary gaps, even advice on buying first home for New Zealanders, which is great. And today he's going to be talking about his new book, which is actually out in October. It's called We Are Here, an Atlas of Aotearoa. Chris today is going to talk about that project.
That's probably all done now.
He's going to provide an overview of the project, discuss the mahi and curatorial design and technical perspectives. So please welcome Chris.
My name's Chris McDowall. Can you hear me? Yeah, as Guy sort of noted, I've had an odd career. I studied human geography with my colleague Ron, who is the Wellington-based here. I've been for 10 years. Studied human geography, GIS, philosophy, and anthropology at university. My PhD was on data structures for representing vague, dynamic geographic objects. I worked at Manaki Whenua as a scientist on things like cultural heritage mapping, land use capability, soil mapping, landscape modelling, a diverse range of things. I then worked for several years as the technical lead on the Digital New Zealand project. Digital New Zealand, for some of you will be aware, given that Auckland Museum was with one of our wonderful partners. It's a project that is part of the National Library and harvests metadata that describes digital and physical objects from over 200 sources. So Auckland Museum was one of our partners. We also work with places like Radio New Zealand and White's Aviation and Television New Zealand and Kite Hora Whenua and sort of organisations big and small who hold cultural objects. And we took all the metadata and standardised it in a nice standard form and then enabled people to build other experiences on top of that. At that time I didn't do any geographic work at all, but it was a really amazing, stimulating time. And then after leaving the National Library, I've worked for a variety of other places. I've worked for an education startup that was between Auckland and Palo Alto. I've worked for the Data Democracy, Figure NZ, and done a bunch of freelancing for many different places. And I guess I'm saying all of this because these days I don't really know what I am when people ask me what do you do. And so I was really glad that Guy said that I was a geographer because that's what I now write on my arrival form in every So, where are we there? So I know that this is a map, like a talk about that's oriented towards the future, a talk series. But if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to take a little art history deviation. There's a 1997 issue of Transactions in Geographic Information Systems, which is an academic journal, and it's this piece that continues to be one of the two foundational texts that really shape everything that I do. In it, Roger Downs wrote this article called The Geographic Eye, Seeing Through Geographic Information Systems. And it's a remarkable piece of writing. What Downs does is he uses this 17th century painting to interrogate what it is that we do when we use computer maps and when we use GIS stuff, geographic information systems. And I'm just going to read you a few passages from the article. Here's the first. Vermeer's geographer, who was probably modelled on Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, is depicted working amidst maps and charts. including a framed one by Blow on the wall behind, books, a globe by Honduras, a pair of dividers, a cross staff and a set square. We're presented with an image of a man actively pursuing knowledge and understanding through the tools of his trade, a man literally poised over his work. Downes further writes that Vermeer's geographer is captured as he is looking up from a map, pausing, pondering, reflecting. His dividers open in one hand and a closed book under his left. There are two charts on the floor behind him, one partially unrolled. He's leaning forward over his desk, thinking about the world. But interestingly, he's not looking at the world out of a window. Instead, given the patterns of highlight and shadow spilling from the window and the shape of the curtain hanging in his immediate foreground, the geographer is gazing at the wall of his study. He's imagining and projecting thoughts into images. His contemplative gaze is at once intense and yet pensive, focused not in the immediate world of reality, but on the world of the imagination, a world that is being mediated by the map spread in front of him. So those two passages, they set the context, but it's a section right at the end of the article that just really knocks me out. And it's about the same length, so please bear with me, and I promise it's the only extended, the last long quote I'll read. So Downes is discussing the painting composition, and in particular the geographer's pose and expression. And he says, Vermeer was right, both artistically and geographically, to make that subtle but profound change in the direction of the geographer's gaze, up from the map, away from the window, and into the imagination. Geography is not in the map, it happens in the mind, although it happens through and because of the map. Geography is not a passive registration of what is in the world, it's a constructive, active will of thought. Geographical understanding comes into being because the mind is brought to bear on the map. Geography is not even to be seen out of the window, it is a creation of the contemplative mind. Those ideas, obvious and commonplace that they might be to a professional geographer, are nonetheless profound in their implications for understanding the role of geographic information systems in practice and in the process of education. Geography is no more to be found in the map than it is to be found in GIS. Geography is in the gaze of the beholder. And so those words continue to inspire me 20 years after I first encountered them. And I'm afraid I won't offer anything quite so wise or concise over the next 40 minutes. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some work that I've done, and I'm also going to share what I think of when I make maps, and what goes through my head, and the sort of mental space that I'm in when I'm working between technology and observation. Effectively, what do I think about when I look at from the map? So, the context for most of the things I'm going to show you is a print thematic atlas that I've been working on for the last few years. Its title is We Are Here, an Atlas of Aotearoa. And I realized just before as the slide went up that this is actually a draft of the cover and not the final cover, but it's close enough. Can I get a show of hands if anyone can see the map on this?
Oh.
Great. That's actually what we were going for. We want people not to see it immediately and then see it maybe after they've had it for a little while. So this cover was actually created with my co-author, Tim Denee, who's a graphic designer, amazing designer and illustrator based in Wellington. The origin and the journey that we've taken on this book is really complicated. The short story is that the project has changed shape several times, and it was mainly worked on in nights and weekends, and there were many points where I thought it would never happen at all. The book is a collection of thematic maps and data visualizations. It's organised into 8 chapters. Te whenua, air and water, living things, places, people, government, movement and energy, art and memory. And probably the closest project is Russell Kirkpatrick's excellent Contemporary Atlas of New Zealand, which was published in 1999. And probably it's a little different, but also the Historical Atlas of New Zealand, I think was published in 1998. It's basically been 20 years since someone made a general atlas in print in New Zealand, which I didn't really realise when we started it off, but there you go. So in a talk like this, I looked for a way to organise this sort of tangle of disparate observations into a sort of coherent fashion, vaguely coherent. And in doing this, and actually a talk I gave a little while ago, I rediscovered a wonderful series of 22 tweets that were written by Emma Coates. And at the time, Emma, they've become quite famous in the years since she wrote them, but she was working as a storyboarder for Pixar, the animation studio behind things like Toy Story, Finding Nemo, WALL-E, and Inside Out. And so back in 2011, she shared on Twitter a series of informal storytelling rules that Pixar uses to guide their narratives. And they've come to be informally known as Pixar's rules, 22 rules of storytelling. So I really admire these rules for their insights and their practicality. Here's the first one. You admire a character for trying more than for their successes. This is rule 6. So reading through these Emma Coates tweets, I was struck by how many yielded insights beyond storytelling and into the realm of design in general. And I realized that in under 140 characters, the character limit of Twitter at the time, she'd often captured the heart of what I wanted to share with people when I talk about this stuff. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to use a sample of these storytelling maxims to explore this space of contemplation of Vermeer's geographer. So rule number 2, you've got to keep in mind what's interesting to you as an audience, not what's fun to do as a writer. They can be very different. And if I substitute the word writer for map maker or designer, this rule is a lens for understanding certain mistakes that I've made over the years. When it comes to maps, it's easy for me to forget that I'm not like other people. And here's an illustration of that. It's not a perfect parable, but there's a kernel of a lesson in there. At the end of last year, I was in Japan, and we caught many trains during that time. And one afternoon, we were in one of Tokyo's smaller railway stations. And most of the stations that we passed through had annotations and place names that were also written in English. And this particular station didn't. And I loved it. And I sort of turned the map into a puzzle where I tried to match the Japanese characters and our destination with a map, and it took a couple of minutes, but eventually I solved the map. And it was a delight. And then I looked to my right, and I saw these 2 very stressed out Western tourists getting more and more anxious as they couldn't find their way. And this experience was awful for them. And they were hot and flustered and confused. And it was a reminder to me that there are varying degrees of patience for maps. And I was reading this thing with a cartographer's familiarity and enthusiasm, and to them, it was just this thing in an unknown language that was a stressful obstacle. And so what was fun for me as a cartographer was just a pain in the neck for a more typical audience. This isn't one of the maxims. This is my editor as the book was starting to change. So I was just making map after map after map, sort of map, and she was wise enough, Nicola Leggett was wise enough and experienced enough to recognise that it was just going to be too much for people. And there needed to be some rest stops, and there needed to be places for people to breathe and take stock. So we added these interstitials. These are all drawn by Tim. These tone-setting full-page spreads that introduce each chapter. And following each of these interstitial spreads, we approached 8 different writers, and each of them wrote a short piece of about 1,200 words that would sit ahead of each chapter and sort of set the tone rather than through imagery but through words. And these 8 contributors, they vary wildly in approach and in the tone that they took, but somehow they can cohere into a whole, a really beautiful whole. And so we ended up with a structure that falls into I think a much more easy rhythm for people. So we've got each row here is a chapter. In blue we've sort of got these 8 graphics for the 8 chapters. We've got 8 essays and an afterword. And here's a couple more of of Tim's spreads. This is the one that introduces the chapter on place. And I really love this. I think this is probably my favourite. The spread on government. And then we've got a whole bunch of maps that each row is a chapter. By the way, this is not indicative of the quality of the visualizations. This is something I made about a minute yesterday. And instead of having all maps, we've also got data visualizations that are spliced in there as well. And so that's the whole book. I think there's about 87 spreads or something like that, 87 visualizations. Around about 10 to 11 in each chapter. And Nicola was absolutely right. In thinking more about the reader and not what I enjoyed, I just wanted to have more maps in the album, more maps. But it actually, by doing a little bit less, people get much more out of it. This is number 5. Simplify, focus, combine characters, hop over details. You'll feel like you're losing valuable stuff, but it sets you free. Here's a spread from the Atlas, and it's around the distribution of birds in New Zealand. And we had lots of unsuccessful attempts before we showed this. I'll just remove that little slide there. Initially, what we tried to do was we tried to show everything. We had bird sighting data for 200 different bird species, and we were trying to show sort of bird diversity and just find ways to aggregate it all together to kind of have this big national map where it's just all the data thrown onto the map. And the best that we got was sort of observational richness, where each dot counted the number of birds that were observed at each spot. But when we showed it to people, it just left them really cold. And there was nothing for them to hang on to, and it was too abstract. And so instead we just opted to choose a few key characters. Tui, Weka, Kia, Kakapo. And even though we showed less, people see much more. The thing that, and it's kind of amazing, to me at least, the thing that people overwhelmingly first say is, I feel really dumb, but all the gannets around the coast, eh? And that unlocks the rest of the other maps for them. Once they've got the kind of satisfaction of recognizing a thing, then they can find other things in there. Here's a bit where we get a little bit more embarrassing. Until last year, the start of last year, I didn't know how to read a geology map. I just didn't get it. I'd never studied geology proper. I'd studied some sort of physical geography, but never actually geology. I couldn't make sense of the colours, I couldn't make sense of the symbols, my knowledge of geological eras and periods is really dim at best. It was disgraceful. And so I learned to interpret them because I knew that we needed some sort of geology adjacent. Oh, there's a one up there. I didn't realise that. That's great. Oh, excellent. I'm still not great at it. But I started trying to make these things, and we'd show even our simplified geology maps to normal people. And wow, they really did not get them. This, I want to be clear, this is an amazing map. It is an incredible map if you're a specialist geologist. It's absolutely astonishing. But what we ended up doing was as cartographers, we can be blind as to how tricky a map can be, an unfamiliar map to people. And so, and it's more than that. We also sort of forget that there's an emotional dimension to being confronted with something that's hard or opaque. And what we were getting was, even in our simplified maps, people just responding, literally sometimes saying, I guess this one just isn't for me. And so without a foothold, without a thing to get them kind of started, an obvious starting place, people would just turn the page or quietly sort of just close that tab. So our solution was to make a bridge map, which helped people appreciate just the age of geological formations. This one's sort of come out a little bit different on the projector, I'm sorry about that. And we've actually got two such maps, one at the national scale and another which is zoomed in on the top of the South Island. This sort of hits a point later on in the talk, but we'd show people this map, and I'm often listening to the statements that people will make as they're reading a map. And one of the things they'll say is, oh, so the oldest rocks are at the top of the South Island. And we heard quite a few people say that, and so then we just did the next page as just the most ancient rocks in New Zealand. And it seems that people would get this sort of satisfaction as they turned the page and saw this. And so we tried to build people up until then we get to this map, which is a more greatly simplified but still a map of New Zealand just showing what is the origins of the different rocks, and like, are they from a volcano, are they from sediment, or are they ones that have kind of metamorphized under the earth, and just showing their age. And it's been really interesting as we watch people who spend a bit of time, they actually get this map, whereas when we didn't have that bridge map in front of it, people wouldn't understand it. And so there's this sort of, by kind of like teasing out age away from origin, and showing less on each map, people tend to take away more. You have to know yourself. The difference between doing your best and fussing. Story is testing, not refining. So this is probably the big one for me. Going into this project, I was aware of my tendency to noodle on it. And I also knew that showing things to people, like showing them is a really great motivator for me. But it's also a bit scary. So with this in mind, I started a small group of, I gathered a small group of acquaintances, people who I knew reasonably well or just sort of tangentially, who had an interest in maps that I could test the maps and graphics on, but people who weren't professionals, people who weren't in the sort of data analysis or visualization community. So I approached these 12 people, and I wanted them to be proxies for the wider readership. And I sent them some maps. So during the first 2 rounds of email, their responses were great. These amazing thoughts about what did and didn't work, and the responses were really motivating, and the insights improved the work. And sure, some people didn't respond, but it was fine. And then in the 3rd and 4th round, this sort of thing became way more common. Apologies, really snowed under, I'll take a look next week, I hope all is well. I recognize these emails because I've written these emails just way too many times myself. And by the 5th round, there was just silence. And the novelty had just completely worn off, and people were busy, and everybody had good intentions, but life gets in the way, and it takes time to review maps, and think about what to say, and write it up, and send it off. And I understood that, so I didn't hassle them. And if I'm honest, it also made me feel really bad. And that point there, was where I made the big mistake of the project. Instead of finding another way to get feedback, I retreated and I pulled the project closer to me, and I worked in almost total isolation. And I beavered away on these maps in private, not showing them to anybody at all apart from Tim and my partner Kate, and I just kept getting stuck, and I would throw myself back at the wall over and over, and there was doubt and frustration and imposter syndrome, just the works. And a sequence of things pulled me out of this cycle. The first was actually an extended trip overseas for a friend's wedding in India, in Punjab, followed by a month in the Himalayas. And leaving that book behind just provided just really great space. The second thing also involved distance, and it was I got really sick. I became sick with influenza, which then pneumonia developed on top of, and it knocked me out for about 2 months. And that was then followed by another couple of months of fatigue and reduced work hours. And somewhere in that sickness, I just got the confidence to just throw away everything that we've done. And, not everything, but almost everything, and start again. But the third, and the most important, is that I started showing the work to people again. I started testing the ideas, but I changed the strategy. So these days when I test, I invite people over. I feed them, I offer them a drink, and do a little bit of scene setting. And then I encourage them to in the scene setting, I encourage them to go at their own pace. I reassure them that this is a work in progress, and that anything that doesn't make sense is my fault rather than theirs. I ask them to speak aloud about what's going on in their head, especially when they're uncertain about something, or if they come to some sort of realization. I used to encourage them to gesture when they were talking, but this turned out to be completely unnecessary, because most people can't help themselves. And then I sit them down at my desk and I get them to page through these sequences of maps. And during the session I say as little as possible. I sit behind, out of their field of view, and take notes. I observe how long they spend on each map, which ones do they linger on and which do they skip past. What insights do they gain? What do they misinterpret? What stories or memories do they share? What do they miss altogether? When they fall silent, I wait and gently ask, what's going through your head right now? And the thing that they say in response is almost always crucial. It surprises me that peers of people are often more useful than individuals. Watching the interactions is fascinating. And in addition to the questions I mentioned just a moment ago, there's also which maps do they tell one another stories about? What stories do they tell? What do they debate? When does one person want to go forward and the other person want to stay back? And with peers, I speak even less, although when one person's more dominant, there's a need to occasionally prompt the quieter person. So I bring people in for an afternoon, I make them feel welcome in my house, I show them a whole lot of hopefully interesting stuff, and they're gone. And that's it. And there are no more commitments. They leave, hopefully seeing something interesting, and I've got pages of deeply useful observational notes. And I try not to use that person again because now they're tainted, and they've seen it. I do still send maps to people, but they're domain experts. So they're people with pre-existing specialist knowledge and an interest in the topic. And those are the people who keep me honest, and they fill the many holes in my own knowledge. So here's a small example. This map of lightning strikes originally had place names, and people kept expressing disappointment. Here are some of the things they'd say. They'd just say, take the labels off, or the place names take away from the map. Do you need places on every map? And so we did. And I think it's the only time in the book that we don't have any place names. Although there is a tendency to sparseness throughout the whole thing. And I think they were right. The place names disrupted the eye's movement as it flows over that data surface. And we're left with this ghostly electrical image. The text encourages the reader. Actually, can we dim the lights? I should have said that at the start. Thank you very much. The text encourages the reader to look for traces of coasts and mountains. And again, there's this moment of small delight where the casual reader makes out the Southern Alps, or Mount Taranaki, or the Central Plateau, or the Coromandel. Number 10. I'm not going through all 22, by the way, just there's only a few. Pull apart the stories that you like. What you like in them is part of you, and you've got to recognize it before you can use it. So for a long time, I've collected examples of things that catch my eye, and at first I used a combination of bookmarks and saved files, and then I just relented. Dropped all my concerns I had about Pinterest and started using Pinterest boards. It doesn't have to be Pinterest. This is just what works for me. Collecting these things, though, together has helped me understand my own tastes, and it's helped me understand what it is that inspires me. And I'm often asking me why do I like this, and how do these maps work? These personal collections serve as both an inspiration and as memory prompts, and also as a collaborative space for Tim and I. Looking through these boards, I see patterns, and it helps me realise that I'm drawn to certain things that deal with scale or texture or linkages. And I'm also drawn in by annotations and captioning, and I really love white space and maps that are all figure and minimal ground. I've got other boards too, so this is some of the others deal with art and typography and installations and retro computer graphics. And these are places that I regularly visit to challenge myself and to get a lift from the incredible work of others. And I think they're things that are useful to have design conversations around. I don't think they should dictate the design, but they're good ways of getting a shared point of reference. I also am just incredibly grateful to different people around the internet who contribute their own work so generously and thoughts. I'll just show you a few really quickly. So there's Nathan Yao from Floating Data, there's Tom Patterson and his work at Shaded Relief, there's Daniel Huffman and his work at Something About Maps. And what I've learned from looking at all of these places are, as I said before, how much I am interested in texture in particular, and in linkages and in typography, not typography so much as labels and annotations. So I'm going to show you a bunch of spreads from the book, which are examples of that. So this is actually the first from the book. Again, it's a little bit faded. I should have really zoomed in on the screen. But I just really wanted to get the texture of the ocean. And so we spent quite a lot of time working on the shadows and the shadowing. It's actually quite bumpy when you see it in print, and we watch people trace their fingers and are surprised that there aren't bumps. This is another map that's kind of really all about texture in a way in terms of how it's presented. This is a map of Christchurch following the earthquakes, and the areas that are blue sank up to 1 metre in some cases, and the areas in red rose up, and then we've got the building footprints on top of them. And so you can see that along the Avon River there, which is the squiggly line that snakes from left to right down to the Avon Heathrow Estuary Harbour. All along there, just how heavily it sank down. There's these interesting pockets of red though, where new subdivisions have been built just ahead of the earthquakes up above the red zone. So yeah, and again, just trying to use texture to tell that story, both the combination of the buildings and this continuous kind of data surface of things rising and falling. This is another one. These are little portraits of cities. We took 2014 was declared by the Met Service in NIWA as the most average year of weather in like the last 10 years. It's an amazing way that they called it. And so we've got a couple of examples from 2014 because it makes a nice case study of an average year. And what we originally tried traditional windroses and found people weren't really interpreting them as they found difficulties in interpreting them, and we ended up coming up with this approach, or I ended up coming with this approach of just taking hourly observations of the wind over the course of an entire year, so every hour of the year, and creating these sort of radial plots. So Wellington, you can see, is just here, and the further away it is, the more often it blew and stronger. So it's much more clearly described in the text. But really strong, like heaps of strong northerlies, heaps of strong southerlies in Wellington, and not much else. And again, just trying to use texture in order to do that. And this is the final one in the series. This is a map that was actually really hard to figure out how to do. I really wanted to show a map that showed both where people live and where they work at the same time. And we ended up taking the last census data, and it's so painful. We actually delayed the book by a year in order to get the census in, but the census still isn't out, so we're putting the book out. And I'll do a bunch of digital stuff online. But here, what we did was we got the census counts at the neighbourhood, at the block level, at the finest, the mesh block level, and then counted how many people lived there, how many people worked there, and then randomly placed red dots where people worked and black dots where people lived. And so we've got these for a whole bunch of New Zealand cities, but just trying to show these pockets using density of texture in order to show pockets of places where people work in the central city and around Green Lane and down heaps of people around Penrose and Wellington, and then all of it, and then the kind of density of residential population as well, but also where the mixes are, where there are people mixed together, both living and working. Oh, and this is the final one actually. We break, so there's a series of about 8 of those city maps. It's the only long sequence that we have, but we actually break it halfway through to zoom in, and we took some Auckland Council LiDAR data, and I generated the surface based, I derived a couple of data surfaces from it, and then made this portrayal of rooftops. So we kind of zoom in to an area between One Tree Hill, Wellington, Penrose, Royal Oak, to show how this looks on the ground. And so these all of the residential areas in the top left, and all of those massive warehouses in the bottom right, to try and kind of ground that data, and again using texture in order to do that. I'm going to just take a really quick technical detour because this is called Futureslam, and that way I can not talk about design all the time, just about technology. This is for print work. I've got the next one's for digital, but this is basically what I use in order to do stuff. So I prepare things using either Python or R. I sort of sketch things using TileMill and Mapnik, or D3 or Quantum GIS or ggplot2 within the R universe. I'm just going to blur out some acronyms and stuff. So apologies, but I'm happy to answer questions on this. And then Adobe Illustrator to take it from kind of a sketch into a final form. For web presentation, this is not how I used to do it. It's dumber than what I used to do because I'm kind of into dumb things that work these days instead of fancy things that go out of date. Again, prepare things in Python and R. I do my sketching rather than in TileMill, which is, I'm going to have to find a replacement for that because it's end of life. But I often use Kato to do web stuff. I still use the D3 JavaScript library to do a lot of visualizations. I might use Quantum GIS and might use ggplot2. And then I present things either in pure D3 or in Kato, or I prepare them in Adobe Illustrator, just export them out as SVGs and put them up. That probably wasn't useful for 95% of the work. But this is an example, and I just wanted to show you an example of what it actually looks like. So this is the spread that took the longest in this book. And I knew I wanted one or two spreads around New Zealand music in the Heart and Memory chapter. And what I did was I went to the Discogs. I needed a data source, because that's the thing, is that it's that there aren't great comprehensive data sources around New Zealand music, as I'm sure people who worked on the New Zealand music project in this room probably are aware. So first thing I did was I went to Discogs, which is a international record nerd website, and they have a nice data service API. I wrote in Python, a little spider program that crawled across Discogs, crawled across actually their data service, looking for New Zealand artists, and I had all these complicated rules about recognizing what a New Zealand artist was. I then took all of the data I harvested from there, and I wrote a second program that transformed that into, so that the shape of the data was lent itself to being visualized as a network graph. And so then I made this, I don't have a bigger version of this I'm afraid, I made these kind of like draft network graphs looking at bands that had members in common. And so I was looking at commonalities between members and trying to build up this social network of New Zealand musicians. And it just was, I don't know, it was like, it's just so hard to interpret these sorts of things. And then I also found that Discogs was really, it's incredible in terms of like the releases themselves and the
details around that sort of thing, but not so good on whether it's from the countries of origin, and it was just, yeah, difficult. So then I went to audio culture and thought, okay, audio culture, and we ended up using audio culture. That will be my my data set, nearly 800 odd musicians and artists and bands who are in audio culture, and I'll caveat it around, there's a leaning towards the 70s and the 80s on this, and so on and so forth. This is a lot of early music, also a lot of late music, quite rock biased, yeah. So I then wrote a different Python scraper. This time it was a scraper rather than, because they don't have a data API, which pulls in data, works with audio culture pages, then build other graphs, and still it was like, I don't know what any of this represents. These are all kind of just like working graphics, and it was like labels and artists, and then we tried laying it out, and it was just like, we just couldn't fit them all on the page, and even then it wasn't very good. Then I got totally waylaid and started like going, oh, well maybe we could do like stuff around songs, and I wrote these like small visualizations that like, I did one for Lord's Royals and one for Damn Native on my cool style, looking at lyrical structure within a song, and it was just like, it's such that siren's call of something that kind of looks good, but actually is just like so bad. Here the words are, the nodes are words, and the edges are things that are close to other. It's just stupid. Then I realised it was terrible and gave up for a few months on that one and went to other things. And then I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure this will work, and I'd seen an example like this before. And I re-harvested audio culture, because in the meantime they'd written a whole lot of new biographies. We put everything to a massive spreadsheet, and I worked with a friend I'm very grateful to, Gareth Shute, who was, actually contributes to audio culture and is a musician himself. And between the two of us, we spent many hours working through the spreadsheet, dating the beginning and the end of an artist or a musician's active period. Often these were explicitly in the article, sometimes they weren't. Often we've got them wrong probably, and we've tried to be upfront about that. We also classified them into genres. So we did this in a spreadsheet. It took a long time. There are about 800 or so of these. Then I wrote a D3 script, so a sort of a JavaScript visualization framework with D3, which took that spreadsheet and it would automatically generate this timeline, and you're seeing the left-hand side of the timeline. And this is what we ended up with. So it's a double-page spread that starts in 1924, and then you turn the page and you've got the full thing. So it's almost, so every line is an artist's lifetime as an active musician, and kind of like major performances and record releases. And you almost build up this kind of geology of artists, and sort of seeing these musical genres appear, and I'm so glad this worked out, because if it hadn't been, and there are many things like this where we put almost as much work in that just didn't work. And it's like, oh, it didn't work. Oh. That is what's involved in some of the work. Other things took a day. So there's other things in here that took a day and maybe another day of typing. This was one that probably took 140 hours. Nearly there. If you're a character in this situation, how would you feel? Oh my goodness, I'm way over time. I'm sorry to show. In terms of questions and things. Honesty lends credibility to unfamiliar situations. So I'm often trying to think about what it would be like to encounter something for the first time. And I've got kind of really interested in, because this is a book, what does turning the page feel like? And from watching people work on the screen, and as we started printing things off, it was more and more clear. So this is a map that appears near the beginning of the book in the Te Whenua chapter on deep earthquakes, and it's 10 years of earthquake data below 40 kilometres. And some people instantly sort of realise what it is. So I do love the way that you can see the subduction plate here, if you kind of know what you, once you get your head around it. So the dark black circles are really deep, and the lighter circles are much higher up, and the circle size is the intensity. But you can see that sort of right to left movement as it drops down into the plates. But what happens is people look at this and they don't read the title, they don't read the paragraphs, they don't read the how to read, they don't read the key. And they look at it and they go, oh, what is Christchurch? It's like, that's weird, there's no earthquakes in Christchurch. Then they read the text, they don't read that it's deep earthquakes, they don't read the key. They do tend to see that it's 10 years of data and think that it's strange, and then they turn the page. Whoa, whoa. Oh my goodness, nearly there, but I'm really good with technology. This is a good reminder of how much I've got to look through. They turn the page and they see the shallow earthquakes, and then they flip back, and then they flip forward, and they put it together. And it was deliberate. We started showing up all of them together, but then in separating it and actually having this moment where they didn't get it, but then they get it, it's actually, we found it really powerful. This is a similar but different. These are commute patterns. So it's the home to work commute for Auckland. So again, this is like one of these really minimal maps where we're showing the patterns of these kind of like hubs that people work in, and how everyone in Auckland is going everywhere all at once. And this map, I don't think really makes sense until you turn the page and you see what Wellington looks like. And so Wellington has this incredible starburst shape because everyone's just working in the centre of town. That's an overstatement, but so many people are working in the centre of town, and it's so much more densely packed than the centre of Auckland in terms of the number of workers. And the geography of Wellington and the train line just funnel people down, and we'll see people flip back and look at Auckland and flip forward and flip back, and listening to them make conversation, it's like, they're getting this, they're getting it. Nearly there. Another thing in terms of the interaction is just increasingly making things where people will trace their fingers in order to interpret it. And it's sort of like, I don't know, people talk about interactivity in digital so much, and I just think that sometimes it's just ridiculous. Because it's like, just sticking a button on something is not, I don't know, I just don't think it's interactive, like being able to toggle backwards and forth. Like, there is some amazing examples of interactivity, but just the virtue of like putting a checkbox or a toggle button isn't interactivity. To me, a person interacting literally with body is what, to me, it is a really great signifier of interactivity. So this is a history of citizenship from 1949, when New Zealand citizenship came into being. It wasn't a thing before that. We're all citizens of the United Kingdom, people who lived here before that. And the kind of like different waves, and watching people as they trace along Taiwan or Cambodia or India or Samoa, and sort of seeing over time. Another one where we have people tracing is, this one might be a bit tricky to see, but this was, we wanted to show what New Zealand scientists do in the Antarctic. So we got some GPS trails from an Antarctic exhibition that took place a couple of years ago, and we mapped those where the people went over a 2-week period and labelled a lot of the things that they were doing. So looking for taking soil samples, or measuring microclimate, or going up to a spot to install a climate station. And people can't help themselves, they use their fingers and they trace the path that people took up and down these Antarctic valleys. This is, I think, the final one I'll show. We're nearly there. Is who visits, and it's visitation to Aotearoa since 1980, and so each row here is a different country of residence for the person who is visiting, and showing the change. So Australia is always at the top, it's always been at the top, but showing some sort of changing not fortunes, but the changing popularity from different places. There's really interesting things in there, like the rise and fall of Ireland, the rise, it almost correlated with the financial crisis, the tremendous rise of South Korea and especially of China. China wasn't even, neither of those were actually even in the top 25 back in 1918, now they're right at the top. And sort of, and we'll watch people sort of go along with their fingers and trace these histories. Last one. When you're stuck, make a list of what wouldn't happen next. Lots of the times, the material to get you unstuck will show up. So this is one of the pairs of maps where we got really stuck. And I've actually put up an older version of this. We've changed it a little bit, but it's basically the same. The text, though, is no longer this text. The text is completely different. But I'm going to read you this text. A rewritten version of this actually now appears in the introduction. I did not think that this map was at all appropriate to put in, but I was so stuck on how to make a physical map of New Zealand. And so I ended up making this, and I just wrote this. Sometimes I worry that when New Zealanders look at maps of their country, they hardly see anything at all. Those distinctive landforms, coloured in soothing greens, browns and white, are so commonplace that people glaze over. These maps make the familiar unfamiliar, rendering elevation contour lines in high contrast blood red and flame yellow against darkness. The landscape becomes a body, fjords read as brain-like folds and wrinkles, rivers are arteries, plateaus are gauzy translucent sheets of skin. The right page shows Setolo Tiger and Southland in greater detail. So we don't have that text in there anymore. The text is more in keeping with the rest of the book. But that was actually, I kept on making these maps that people would flip past. And this map is not just there for people to like, it's not supposed to be like, I don't know, whatever the cartographic equivalent of clickbait is. It's not there just to kind of shock. But it's actually because as I got people to look at this map that I didn't think would work, it turned out that it worked. And that as people looked at it, particularly in print, they really were drawn into it, and both kind of a popular audience, like a sort of a lay audience, and a specialist audience were telling me that they were seeing things that they hadn't seen before. But there's one for the North Island of Elizabeth as well, particularly around the river valleys, particularly around the plains, particularly around the plateaus, and seeing shapes that they actually hadn't seen before in the landscape. This is the final map that I'll show you. It's the second to last map in the book. The book finishes with a trio of maps, one of Aotearoa, one of Honganui, and one of the New Zealand landscape for people, if people had never arrived at all, what the vegetation would look like in a map without people. And I guess I'm just showing you because I really like this map. I wanted to map, I find it extraordinary and just amazing that we have these two landforms that are recognised as legal people. And I think that that's incredible. And I was trying to find a way, Aotearoa I should have included it, I should have shown you what that looks like. It's a more conventional shaded relief map, although just before publication we actually put in like a mist around its edge rather than a boundary, and I think it looks quite well. But we couldn't do justice, I just couldn't do justice to this incredible river, and then actually by removing everything else, like removing all of its context, then it came into view, for me at least, there's actually a level of detail that you can't see on this. I keep making that excuse, I appreciate it. I don't feel like I can sufficiently wrap that up, because I'm still taking this one in, and this one I find, I get a bit lost in it. But it was one where we tried what wouldn't work,
and what shouldn't have worked, I think has worked really well.
Sorry.
Oh, that's good. Luckily, that's the final slide.
Thanks so much. Really looking forward to the book, so yeah, appreciate it.
The book comes out on October 11th.
We still do have some time for questions, about 10 minutes, so please, Cheryl.
Geographer. I find that really fascinating. I'm a human geographer too. And we work in visitor and market research team, so I was interested to see the method that you landed on for getting feedback from readers. It's so similar to what we do in terms of observation with our visitors. What I did wonder though was, how did you decide what went into the book? Was that the things that you thought were cool? Were you trying to tell a particular story? Were you asking readers what they wanted? How did you get there?
It was that in a way was one of the hardest things, and it was not something I'd anticipated to be so difficult. And I've come out the other side of this with this incredible respect for curators and the work that curated, like what curatorship is. I did not have any idea how difficult that endeavour is. I wish I could tell you that there was a great process that we followed from beginning to end, but instead what it really was we had just this massive long list. We had what started off with a document, ended up being a Trello board, like I bought a whole lot of cards, and we had these things. At one point we had 3 sections. At one point we had 22 sections. We ended up with these 8 sections, and it was just an ongoing process of trying something, seeing if it felt right to us, showing it to people, telling the stuff that didn't work, looping back and doing it again and again. It was ongoing iteration until over the 4 or so years that we were doing this. And it really probably locked in about 18 months ago. I'd say 18 months ago is when the serious book work started. The first 2.5 years were like, what are we doing? Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you.
It was just ongoing iteration and testing and fun.
How did you locate the data sets and what data sets did you use?
Okay. So there are 2 appendices of data in the back. So 2 appendices of technical notes. One on software and a much longer one, spread by spread, talking about all of the data. So that's just one thing to note, is that we'll be publishing that, and also in the data publication, putting up a GitHub repository of all of the code that we use. So all the programming code will get released as open source software at the time as well. It was, I don't know, I'm just kind of embedded in the community of data people, and I see a lot of it, and I know a lot of it, and that isn't a very satisfying response. There are these projects, there's like FigureNZ, for example, and there's data.gov.nz, and these sort of clearinghouses of data, but I still think that you need, I don't know if anybody has really solved that problem of making it clear, oh, you're interested in fire risk, or you're interested in inequality, or you're interested in biodiversity, here are the relevant data sets. It came from me just sort of knowing the landscape and talking to people as well, and actually a lot of the data sets that came up were people giving me tip-offs, like someone going, oh, you should check out blah, blah, blah. They haven't released it, but if you ask them and talk to this person, yeah.
The book is obviously a static publication, and you describe lots of really great qualities of the contemplative and the flipping backwards and forwards, and so on. The book is clean. But one of your pieces of work that we used here quite some time back was the time lapse of Auckland public transport. The gorgeous little caterpillars crawling all over the Auckland landscape over a 24-hour period. I just wonder, are there some of the things that you had intended to include in the book, but then dropped because actually they work better in a digital realm?
Oh, I wish you could hover. Like, so many times I wish that you could hover and get a little pop-up. But it's really not a thing that you can do. Yes, is the answer. We will have it digital. There will be a website that goes live just ahead of the will have some of those things in it.
But they would be different things.
They will be different.
Yeah.
Some of them will be have like enhanced versions of some of the scripts that are in the book. But I've kind of fallen in love with print. Like, oh my goodness, it's so amazing to know what size the thing is that the person can read. Like, that's I think the hardest thing about one of the hardest things about data visualization in 2019 is that most of the time it's less. Like, I had a session with the Herald's data editor last week, and he said 75% is for them now is a mobile. That's a hard thing to work with. Yeah, but definitely.
Following that, as an absolute opposite, will any of those be available in artwork that you can purchase as a separate thing?
If there is a demand for it, yeah. No, I would like to. There's to date I've only done one. A few people have asked for things. There's one I did for somebody that was a sort of a special thing. But I will likely do something like print runs. Yeah, or Tim and I will.
Hey Chris, there's a lot of reckless and careless use of data. So what did you do in terms of the sort of ethical governance? Did you just, I mean, I know you and I know that you're an ethical person, but did you have any sort of check-ins around that?
Yeah, I mean, I alluded to it before around bringing people into my house who represented the readership that sending things to experts. So everything would have gone past. So obviously there's the editors themselves. So there's an editorial process there, but there were things. So it's not here, but there's a map, for example, of Auckland Museum and the features at the end of the book, and particularly looking at the spiritual dimension of this landscape that we live in. And that was something that I worked on with the Maori authority. So it's like I went in and talked to them about the concept. They worked with me on building it up and developing it. I sent it to them to see what they thought about it. They said, oh, this is great, you need to improve this. And so that was representative of the sorts of things that we would do with anything that I had sort of concerns about. And I'm kind of quite I don't know, I'm such a doubtful person, like doubt myself and second guess myself all the time, so I had a tendency to do that. And that was one of the things that unblocked me, was actually in showing things to people, they make it better as well. So it wasn't just to, in part it was to make sure that the visualizations had integrity, but it was also to improve the work. Yeah. All of that was quite informal. It wasn't like we were doing sign-offs or anything like that, but yeah.
So was there data that you really wanted to kind of show, but you couldn't find it? And is there opportunities to kind of capture new data around New Zealand that would?
Yes.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah,
What's your perspective on that?
Yes, and there's certainly, and this is part of in the introductory essay, I write a little bit about this, but the opening of New Zealand's data has been amazing, but there are still, in some quarters, subtle points of resistance from government data that I think should be public, which is not, or for various kind of quirks of the way that New Zealand got restructured in the 90s, like that things that commercial entities run government. So the Met Service, for example, would be a classic example, where it's a run-for-profit kind of organisation, and that's just the reality of what that group does. But the reason we chose those wind cities was because they were the ones that NEWA ran rather than the Met Service. And the Met Service ones, we would have had to pay quite a significant amount of money for those things. I was happy with those, they were a representative script. The Met Service do amazing work in many areas, but yeah, that's one example. There are other things that are not being measured. There's a child, the inequality data came out just before we did this. We finished up, so it was one of the last reads that we did. We really wanted to do something around child poverty. And the data, as it stands today, is
There's some high-level estimates, and that's it. So you can't even say how many children are living in poverty in Auckland. It's just not in the data. You can't say how. This is. So there are some things which are locked up, and there are some things which are not being counted. That child poverty data will improve apparently next year.
We have time for one more question. Anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, just got a quick one. Your lightning strike map
Yes.
didn't have any labels on it. Where?
Did not.
No. Where is that? Where was it?
Oh, that's everywhere.
That's the whole of New Zealand.
That's the whole of New Zealand.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
High bits get struck more.
What's that?
High bits get struck.
High bits do get struck more. Yes. Yeah, so that was the whole country. So I look back, I